In Essential Task 3.6, we are going to continue talking about interactions within a group can affect our thinking and our behavior, specifically talking about the concepts of prejudice and discrimination, while also touching upon concepts such as implicit and explicit bias. I recommend a vertical piece of paper for this concept map. The concept map is under the overall heading of group behavior, but again, that connects 3.5, 3.6, and 3.7. We are specifically going to cover the middle portion under differential treatment. There are two boxes there at the top, and then a two-column breakdown. The box at the bottom left corner looks a little bit taller than it actually is. There's quite a bit of pictures in that bottom left corner, so I don't think you will have much difficulty fitting this on a vertical piece of paper, but I will return to the text of the task so you can pause the video here and copy down that yellow portion. Beginning, we will start all the way at the top. Again, the big header here is group behavior, but we've been working under group behavior now for our second essential task. First two terms to talk about are two terms that we use culturally all the time, and it's important to note that by definition, there's really only one difference here between prejudice and discrimination, and that's highlighted with the red text. We'll start first with prejudice, though. Prejudice is any unjustifiable attitude or thought that you have towards a different group or its group members. That can be cultural, gender, age, religion. There's obviously a variety of topics which group individuals, and prejudice would be any type of unjustifiable thought or attitude towards that group. And that word unjustifiable is really pivotal here. So these are things that are not backed up. On the other hand, when that thought and that attitude and that sort of cognitive element actually translates to behavioral patterns, whether that's enforcing unjust laws or whether that's harm, physical or psychological, then we're starting to look at discrimination, which is unjustifiable treatment of a group and its group members. Meaning that when we reflect on these two terms, the difference here is prejudice is a more cognitive thing. It's thoughts and attitudes. Discrimination is when those thoughts and attitudes actually translate into behavior, whether that's intentional behaviors or whether that's unintentional behaviors. But we're looking at the difference between these two concepts, really breaking down into cognitive elements or behavioral elements. Following the box right below that is the difference between explicit and implicit bias. And it's really important to identify these two terms because in the midst of this essential task, we're going to be talking about interactions with other people. And it's important to note that some interactions and some forms of prejudice and discrimination are explicit, meaning the individual who is exhibiting the prejudice or the discrimination clearly knows that they have these beliefs or that they have these attitudes, or in some cases act upon them through the form of discrimination. These are people who, for one reason or another, are very set in their belief system, and they will willingly tell you that they have some type of bias towards different groups, whether that's religious, gender, age, etc. If you ask somebody who's donning a KKK outfit, they're not going to hide their opinions. They're wearing it on their shoulder. They'll tell you how they feel. That's what we call explicit bias. It's when people are asked sort of point blank about different groups or different people amongst those groups. And they're honest and truthful, and as a result of it, exhibit prejudice in a way that's clear and upfront. What's useful and interesting and important about society is that measurements of explicit bias have luckily, over the past several decades, if not the last 100 years, have luckily gone down. So explicit bias towards minority groups, towards women, a variety of topics, religions, have all gone down. America now is way more willing to vote for a candidate who is a different religion, obviously way more likely to vote for an African-American president had it been 100 years ago. So as a whole, generally speaking, measurements of explicit bias in our country have gone down. What is a little bit more complicated and more debatable and more controversial is the concept of implicit bias, which is the possibility that an individual unknowingly holds some type of prejudice towards a different group or person, some type of belief and attitude, and they don't know it, but it actually does ultimately affect their behavior. So even if they're not consciously aware of it, they're not wearing it on their shoulder like a member of the KKK will, but it nevertheless still permeates and still seeps through their behavioral patterns, and they treat somebody differently or a group of people differently without even necessarily realizing that they're doing it. If you're viewing this at home, I would recommend doing the classwork now and going back and watching the remainder of this. I'd rather you do that first as opposed to watching the video from this point on. In the classwork today, we are going to take a look at Harvard's implicit bias test. I want to make a few things really clear about this clip, or rather about this. One, this is not the end-all be-all. Two, it's been highly criticized by other very significant academic institutions and individuals. So I know the name Harvard is attached to it, but that doesn't necessarily mean what you're about to do is sort of this end-all be-all. I don't want you to go home and talk to people and say, we took a racist test today in my psych class and I got my results and they were not what I wanted. That's not really what we're doing here. I need to make those points very, very clear. But Harvard put together some type of test that's supposed to evaluate the possible presence of an implicit bias. So in the midst of the classwork today, you're going to take one of their many tests, and they have tests regarding gender and sexuality and religion and minority groups, a variety of topics. You'll take any of those tests, see how you do, see how you feel about it. But what essentially that Harvard exam is trying to do is evaluate your measurement of implicit bias by the standards that they established, which, again, can be a bit controversial. However, I still think it's interesting to take a look at this assessment to see one of the ways in which implicit bias tests work, because otherwise it's kind of hard to gauge implicit bias. Just by the definition of it, it's an attitude or belief that you don't really know you have. Nevertheless, continuing onward into our concept map, so assuming that you took the time to take one of those tests and took a look at that Harvard assessment, we're going to now break down the ramifications of the concepts that we just established, the ramifications of implicit or explicit bias, and the ramifications of prejudice and discrimination. First ramification is the tendency to develop what's called an inverse outgroup bias. These two terms can be applied to different races, different religious groups, but it can also be applied to things that are way more low stakes, like different schools. When you exhibit an in-group bias, you tend to favor individuals from a group that you subscribe to more favorably. So just because somebody goes to Apponequet, you might have positive attributes that you ascribe to them, while somebody that goes to ORR or any of the other rival schools, you might sort of automatically view them in a negative light. We'll talk about that in just a second. But you tend to give people with whom you are grouped with the benefit of the doubt. So you look at students from our school and you give them that favorable assessment. This could be more than just school rivals. This could be Red Sox fans. If you're a fan of the Red Sox, you might view Red Sox fans more favorably. You can expand this, though, into topics such as race and religion, and then next thing you know, you're starting to talk about this more in the context of explicit bias, implicit bias, and some forms of discrimination or prejudice when you start to view individuals within your own racial group favorably, and then on the other hand, exhibit an outgroup bias, which is the tendency to view members of other outgroups negatively. So that could very easily be some type of school rival. If you think about what comes to mind when you think about our major rivals, you might have this sort of repulsive response and think, oh, they're horrible people. Well, that's largely not true. But nevertheless, when you view other members of being into a different group, contrary to your own, you tend to view that other group negatively and exhibit what's called an outgroup bias. And again, when we bring then to context things like religion and race, ethnicity, that can sometimes now transition into exhibiting outgroup bias towards other groups, which might be reflected as forms of discrimination or prejudice. What's really important here, some students can kind of confuse how this works. If you see in-group bias as a bullet, you need to talk about how you view your group members favorably. You don't talk about the other groups. It's in-group bias, not outgroup. When you get a bullet for outgroup bias, that is when you can tell me that you, as a member of Apponequet, view other schools in a negative light, and as a result, don't give them the benefit of the doubt, criticize them, judge them, whatever it might be. So if you see one of these as an FRQ bullet, make sure you're writing about it correctly. Some students think these two terms kind of work interchangeably. They do not. In-group is for only members of your school. Outgroup is when you judge other members of other groups. What's interesting is when we explore the in-group and out-group bias and sort of how that can be reflected in our overall behavioral patterns, there's a few different phenomenons which can be exhibited, which kind of fit in the broader sense of this essential task. The first is what we call the out-group homogeneity bias. This happens when you look at an out-group and you have the tendency to group them all together by similar characteristics. So to pick sort of an innocent one, we can do things related to sports. You as a Red Sox fan might say, well, we are the Red Sox, but the Yankee fans, they are all rude. You somehow found a way to group together every single person in that outgroup, the Yankee fans, and identified some type of characteristic that you used to group all of them. They are all rude. While at the same time, when you consider your own in-group, you're way less likely to make sort of that overarching statement. You might say, well, yeah, of course, there are a few rude people within the Red Sox fans, but that's not really a reflection of all Red Sox fans. I'm not going to say anything even remotely like that. Well, that's an incorrect assessment. You can't group all Yankees fans as being rude while looking at rude Red Sox fans next to you and saying, oh, they're the outliers. We're not all like that. Because basically what you've done is you've grouped every member of the out-group into a similar criteria or a similar assessment, and then given your own in-group the leverage to be more diverse, which in and of itself is largely inaccurate. I imagine Red Sox and Yankees fans are probably equally as rude at the end of the day. And the out-group homogeneity bias can certainly play into how we view different racial groups or different ethnic groups or different religious groups. When people start to view other out-groups all within that same criteria, you really can start to see prejudice and discriminatory behavior. The next is when your in-group's beliefs, in your opinion, reach the point of feeling superior to others, and when that branches over into cultural views. So now we're talking about sort of an in-group, out-group phenomenon where this isn't your Red Sox fans, they're Yankees fans, nothing like that. This is our ethnic group or our cultural feelings. When it branches over into feeling like your in-group's cultural views are superior to other out-groups' cultural views, then we start to exhibit what's called ethnocentric thinking or ethnocentrism. Depending on who you've had for history, it's not inconceivable that you've seen this word, particularly when talking about some of the early 1920s immigration policies in the United States, and really even prior to that. You talk about something like the immigration restrictions in 1924, and then certainly again prior to that, as I alluded to, it's not inconceivable that you see this type of terminology and this type of phenomenon. I know this isn't a history class per se, but this is a political cartoon from the early 1900s. The last concept is when you look at a society that has a diverse collection of groups. So there's many different groups, many different, whether it's religious, ethnic, whatever it might be, and something bad happens. There's the possibility of what's called scapegoat theory, where an individual or a group can look towards other people as a source of the blame. So one group might blame another group for the downfall of the country or the economic conditions of the country. You know, when we talk about scapegoat theory, sort of that classic example that you probably have familiarity with is Germany after World War II, blaming whether it's German Jews or European Jews for the downfall of Europe or the downfall of Germany. That's scapegoating. I mean, that is classic identifying a differing group, blaming that group somehow for the problems of the group that you're a part of. That's classic scapegoat theory, which brings into question how significant and how important it is to talk about this, in the sense that when we start to break people up and start to differentiate in versus out-group bias, like it can be quite innocent when we talk about it in the context of sports, school rivals. When we start to add cultural and religious and ethnic qualities to this discussion, there are some really significant ramifications to doing so, whether it's ethnocentric thinking or scapegoat theory. The last concept to talk about that can honestly be included into many locations in this concept, in this overall unit. I like to put it into this concept map though, because I think it has a really important tie when talking about different groups. And that's what we call the self-fulfilling prophecy. So I'll give many examples about this that are not directly tied to the discussions of prejudice and discrimination, but I will give some of those as well. The self-fulfilling prophecy occurs when you have some type of expectation about someone. That could be based on a stereotype, some type of racial, gender, age stereotype. And as a result of your expectation, you might, knowingly or unknowingly, indirectly or directly, change how you behave, change how you act with that individual, and as a result, lead that person towards behaving like the stereotype that you had. So, for example, you might be interacting with somebody who's older, and you might have a stereotype. Old people know nothing about technology. And now you train that person at work, and you knowingly or unknowingly, this can happen consciously or unconsciously, train them inadequately. You don't really give them the full detail because in the back of your mind, you're like, this person's old, they won't get it anyway. And now that person has been insufficiently trained, and now that person ends up making mistakes because you insufficiently trained them, and now they get fired. And you sit there and say, well, yeah, duh, you hired somebody who's older. Of course they were going to fail at this position. When in reality, it was your expectations and stereotypes about that person that set them up for failure. That's what we call the self-fulfilling prophecy, when you essentially set somebody up to fail or to exhibit the behavior and stereotype that you have about them when you unknowingly or knowingly lead them into that direction. So you have this impression of someone, they're going to be a terrible worker, you train them poorly, they get fired, you have this moment where you're like, see, I told you so. But is that really a reflection of their behavior, or is it really a reflection of your self-fulfilling prophecy, where you had this expectation about them that directly or indirectly led them to fulfill it? This can happen in academics a lot. If you are told the student that you have next year is a handful, they're tough to work with. Well, now you're going into school that first day. You have this expectation about that student. You might knowingly or unknowingly treat that student differently. Now that student might misbehave, fail your class, and at the end of the year, you look back and say, well, I knew it. I knew that student was going to be a handful. When had you gone all the way back to the beginning of the year and never been told that about that student, would that have changed anything? Would you have treated that student differently? Would you have had that expectation in the back of your mind? Would the year have gone better? Could it be possible that you implemented, and often this happens accidentally, but pushed a self-fulfilling prophecy? This can happen whether it's in academics, this can happen in the workplace, and this can happen with topics that we've been discussing already in this essential task, whether that's race or gender, etc. If you have a stereotype that females wouldn't like this job or males wouldn't like this job, and you train that person improperly, well, next thing you know, that person might get fired for being poorly trained, and that's not necessarily their fault. So the self-fulfilling prophecy occurs, and it's a couple step. You have an expectation about someone based on some type of stereotype or just an individual expectation about that person. As a result, it changes how you treat that person. And ultimately, that person fulfills the prophecy, meaning they actually act like the stereotype. And that might not necessarily be a reflection of their own behavior. They might not necessarily reflect that stereotype at all, but it's more of a reflection of the fact that you treated them differently, leading them to fulfill that prophecy.